The US government just bought into Intel, but this isn't about supporting American innovation. It's about control. And if history is any guide, consumers, startups, and the free market are about to pay the price. In case you aren't aware, the US government bought 10% of semiconductor manufacturer Intel. And in doing so, Intel created more shares so that the government could purchase that 10% stake. The US government is now the single largest shareholder in Intel, which is notable by itself, but there are a cascading series of questions about what this is and what it means. I don't think the media has done a very good job of talking about this, and that includes CNBC and even the Wall Street Journal. Seemingly, they're fascinated with the idea that this hasn't happened before, or it's novel, or it's interesting, or it's scary, or it's just fantastic, whatever the case may be. I want to break down what this actually means and how it's going to impact tech and business in the United States. So let's get a few housekeeping items out of the way. Yes, the government has that 10% stake, and no, they don't get a board seat, they don't get voting rights, but they are now the single largest shareholder in Intel. And if you think that they'll be treated like any other major shareholder, I think you're kidding yourself. According to Kevin Hassett, Trump's director of the National Economic Council, this administration wants to do more of these deals. And to me, that's bad news. For anyone claiming that there is a precedent here, let's review the history of the US government taking over control of companies or exerting regulatory control and explain why this is a poor attempt at equivalency. Certainly during World War I and World War II, the government nationalized railroads, coal mines, telegraph lines, and specific companies to streamline logistics and production, but that was for an active, ongoing war effort. In 2008, the government seized stakes in banks, mortgage giants Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, and they almost took over insurance companies like AIG. And the whole point there was to prevent some sort of economic collapse, a run on the bank, and to stabilize financial systems. It was an extreme circumstance. General Motors in 2009, during their bankruptcy, the US government gained a 60% stake in GM to rescue the auto industry and save jobs. That control was intended as temporary, and they were planning on returning the company to private ownership once it was stable. GM did pay the government back, but US taxpayers lost about $11.2 billion in that deal. And one that was maybe more a direct example of this was the Continental Illinois Bank in 1984 to 1994. That bank collapsed. It failed, and the government took over after that failure. It later sold it to Bank of America. Again, it was supposed to be a temporary stopgap. Takeovers are usually justified using emergency powers, bankruptcy law, or some kind of public necessity, but they'll face legal and political challenges. But make no mistake, none of that existed here. We're not at war. No banks are collapsing. We aren't shoring up manufacturing or access to critical supplies we can't source elsewhere domestically. Intel hasn't been a particularly well-run company, but it wasn't in jeopardy of failing. And its chips are hardly the only ones available domestically. So we don't even have a manufactured national security concern. So why is this bad? Well, first, I think it distorts the market incentives. That sounds like a high-minded way of saying that innovation thrives on competition. I would argue that without competition, innovation is not motivated. If companies know the government is a shareholder, they may rely on that political protection rather than building better products. Intel doesn't have the best track record of innovation over the last 5 to 10 years. Other competitors are passing it. So does that make that set of circumstances worse? Or are they further incentivized not to innovate? Because the US government may favor Intel for contracts and procurement. And let's not forget, the US government spending is 18% of the US GDP as projected in 2025. 18%. To put that in perspective, The 150 million roughly households in the US, the spending represented by that 150 million households is always the bulk of the GDP from a spending perspective. That's going to be 68%. So every US household is 68%. The government alone is 18%. That is insane purchasing power. So the second thing is the conflict of interest. So if the government is both the regulator and owner of a company, that creates a conflict. Is it setting rules for the public good or to the benefit of its portfolio company? That's going to undermine the trust in fair markets. And competitors in that space, are they really going to be willing to make the investment to try and compete against a major company that has the backing of the US government and potentially the additional conflict of interest that same government can exercise its massive purchasing power and procurement processes for the benefit of that competitor? That's a huge conflict of interest. The third thing is a risk of the government now picking winners and losers. It looks like the government is putting its finger on the scale of the free market, which feels a lot more socialist than capitalist. And if the government backs certain tech firms, it effectively is picking those winners and losers. Startups outside of that circle, just competitors directly to Intel, they may struggle to raise capital. They may struggle to maintain a share price, which in turn capitalizes their company. And that can slow innovation and create concentrations of power. And for all my free market advocates out there, this does become a slippery slope toward industrial policy and state control of the means of production, which are all elements of socialism. So while some countries like China will directly fund or control their tech champions, we in the US historically have not done that. We lean on the private sector to be the risk takers, to innovate and diversify our economy. So the US ownership could blur the line between a quasi-state controlled model or enterprise, which again, runs counter to the US model of free enterprise. The other risk we run is investor and talent flight. So private investors may be wary of competing with the government because they don't want to fund a competitor in a market where the US government is the single largest shareholder of a major competitor. Public investors or investors investing in public equities don't want to invest in companies that could see their own shares diluted because the government decides that it wants that company to issue 12% more shares just so the government can then purchase those shares, thereby diluting all the existing shareholders. Frankly speaking, I'm surprised that Intel's board allowed the company to do that, but I'll leave that alone for right now. Top talent may want to avoid some of these companies if they feel like it's more government contractor than high growth innovator. Intel is already struggling, I think, in the market, certainly with talent of, is this an innovative company or is this just a mature company that's now in bed with the government? And make no mistake, that investment will change how Intel operates. And that includes talent acquisition, the retention of that talent, and company culture. They're now going to have to answer to the White House as well as regular shareholders, both internal and external. There's another layer here, which is the board members of companies like Intel. They come from industries and companies and even maybe have some personal interest in the government's regulatory oversight. They're going to vote in a manner that generates the most favor with US government and its regulators, if for no other reason to avoid speculation or prying eyes into their businesses or into their interests. And in the macro, innovation may slow down. Intel's likely to center its innovation around what the government would like to see or buy, effectively becoming a state-run manufacturing business. If you think that's an overstepping of what potentially could happen, I understand that. But if you have the single largest shareholder of your company telling you, this is what I would spend millions, if not billions of dollars on in this next contract, you're going to take that very seriously, and you're going to look at your product development, you're going to look at your manufacturing, and you're going to look at your distribution differently based on that feedback. The incentives start to shift away from disruptive innovation in that case, which is risky, it's uncertain, but they're going to start shifting towards safer, incremental improvements that please their political shareholders and potentially their largest customer. That's nothing nefarious, that's just good business. You're going to want to have your largest customer very happy and very much ready to continue to purchase products and services from your firm. So for my economic or political wonks out there, I'd be remiss not to bring up the geopolitical or security risks around this transaction, or at least what it signals. If the government owns part of a company, foreign partners, foreign countries, or customers, they might see it as a proxy for the US policy and avoid doing business with that company, especially when they have options. And in this case, they do have options. They could buy from AMD, they could buy from NVIDIA, and maybe not China, but the rest of the world could buy from the largest semiconductor manufacturer of kind of simple semiconductors, which is based in Taiwan. And ultimately, that can shrink international markets for Intel, and it can weaken global competitiveness when they just start sourcing them from other companies. I think it's important to address the difference between the government taking a direct ownership stake in Intel and funding innovation through grants and SBIR and other programs that are designed to push innovation forward and, yes, to fund that innovation. DARPA was largely responsible for what we now commonly refer to as the internet, for GPS, early military R&D. And the government is effective as a funding catalyst or as an early kind of risk absorber, but it's through those grants, contracts, programs like SBIR, but actual equity ownership introduces a distortion in the market that can hurt long-term competitiveness. So here's my take on this. If the government can pick winners and losers by taking ownership stakes in specific companies, the market stops working efficiently for consumers and innovation is going to suffer. This isn't about Intel. It's about the dangerous precedent being set. Because once Washington owns the game, they'll never stop moving the goalposts. That's it for this episode. As always, like, comment, and subscribe, and we'll see you next time.